that I had the capacity to physically help them at that point, I would have done so. But I didn't.
You never thought of the possibility of consoling them in their death?
Before sunrise, everything can look calm, even places built on fear and locked behind gates. A quiet house, a family asleep, the illusion that nothing bad could possibly happen here. But sometimes the most terrifying stories don't begin with strangers breaking in from the outside. They begin from inside the walls, where trust already lives. This case forces you to sit with an uncomfortable question. How well do we really know the people closest to us? Because on paper, this family had everything: wealth, security, routine, and a future that looked carefully planned. There were no obvious warning signs flashing in public, no neighbors calling police, no screams heard through the night, just silence, followed by a phone call that didn't sound the way it should have. What unfolded next would leave investigators stunned, a community shaken, and a survivor trapped in a life without memory. Every detail raised another contradiction. Every explanation created more doubt. And the closer authorities looked, the harder it became to believe that this was a random act of violence at all. This is not just a story about brutality, it's a story about delay, denial, and the thin line between appearances and reality, about how motive can hide behind privilege, and how truth doesn't always arrive screaming. It sometimes whispers, calmly, into an emergency operator's headset. And once you hear the full picture, you'll understand why this case still divides opinions today, and why some questions may never truly have answers. The emergency call sounded wrong from the very beginning. Not panicked, not rushed, not frantic in the way you'd expect when someone wakes up to unimaginable violence. The voice on the line asked for ambulances, more than one, and described head injuries in a strangely measured tone. There was hesitation, long pauses, words that didn't quite land where they should. By the time police cars rolled through the gates of the luxury estate that morning, the sense that something was deeply off had already settled in. The Van Breda home sat inside one of South Africa's most secure residential communities, a place defined by high walls, armed patrols, controlled access points, and a near-obsessive emphasis on safety. Nothing about this environment suggested vulnerability. Inside, however, officers were met with a scene so violent that seasoned first responders would later describe it as the worst they had seen in decades. Blood streaked down staircases and pooled across floors. Walls were splattered. The smell of iron hung heavy in the air. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was a slaughter. Marley van Breda was dead, struck repeatedly with an axe, his injuries suggesting he had tried to shield someone else with his own body. His wife, Teresa, lay lifeless nearby, brutally attacked in her bedroom. Their eldest son, Rudy, had been killed where he slept. Only one family member was still alive inside the house: 16-year-old Marley, gravely wounded, her jugular severed, barely clinging to life. She would survive, but with devastating consequences. Her memory of that night would be erased completely. Standing outside the house was Henri van Breda, their 20-year-old son. He was alive, conscious, and covered in blood that did not belong to him. His injuries were minor, superficial cuts that required little medical attention. The contrast was impossible to ignore. 3 people dead from catastrophic head trauma, 1 teenager fighting for her life, and 1 young man virtually untouched by the level of violence that had filled the house. Henri's explanation was simple. He claimed intruders had entered the home during the early morning hours. He said he'd been in the bathroom when he heard strange noises. His father ran toward the sound. Henri followed, tried to fight back, was injured, and then lost consciousness. When he woke up, his family had been attacked. The intruders, he said, had fled. At first glance, the story didn't sound impossible. South Africa has no shortage of violent crime, and home invasions do happen. But this wasn't an ordinary house, and this wasn't an ordinary crime scene. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken alarms, no tripped sensors, nothing stolen, not cash, not jewelry, not electronics. Whoever did this had moved through the house with precision, room by room, targeting sleeping occupants, leaving behind nothing but devastation. Then, investigators noticed the timeline. Phone records showed that Henri had called his girlfriend hours before he contacted emergency services. He searched online for emergency numbers, despite the fact that they were reportedly posted on the family refrigerator. Nearly 3 hours passed between the estimated time of the attack and the call for help. 3 hours during which blood continued to flow. 3 hours during which Marley lay bleeding, unnoticed but alive. Forensic evidence began to tell its own story. The wounds on the victims showed consistent force, consistent angles, consistent attack patterns, signs pointing to a single attacker. Marley's injuries suggested she had been awake and tried to defend herself. The others likely never had the chance. Henri's injuries, on the other hand, appeared controlled, shallow, and deliberate. Experts would later testify they looked self-inflicted, designed to support a story rather than survive a real struggle. As Marley was placed into intensive care and later transferred to long-term rehabilitation, investigators made a quiet but critical decision. They separated the siblings. Henri was sent to live with relatives. Marley was placed elsewhere, far from him. She was the only living witness, even if she no longer remembered what she'd seen. As days turned into weeks, more details surfaced. Henri's history of drug use, his parents' decision to cut him off financially, the immense value of the family estate, the growing tension inside a household that, from the outside, had looked flawless. What once seemed like an unspeakable tragedy was beginning to look like something else entirely. And with every unanswered question, one possibility became harder to ignore. The danger may never have come from outside the gates at all. As the investigation deepened, the idea of random intruders quickly began to collapse under the weight of evidence. Security experts were brought in to assess the estate, and their conclusions were blunt. The Dales Golf estate was not just secure, it was designed to prevent exactly this kind of crime. Armed guards patrolled regularly. Access was logged and monitored. Motion sensors and alarms surrounded the property. For outsiders to enter, move freely through the house, murder 3 people, and escape without triggering a single alert would have required near superhuman precision. Investigators testified that even a highly trained criminal would have struggled to pull it off unnoticed. Inside the house, the pattern of violence told a story of familiarity. The attacker moved confidently from bedroom to bedroom, knowing exactly where each family member slept. There was no hesitation, no wandering, no signs of searching. The blows were consistent in strength and direction, suggesting one person wielded the axe from start to finish. This wasn't chaos, it was methodical. The more forensic specialists examined the scene, the harder it became to reconcile it with Henri's account. If he had truly wrestled with an axe-wielding intruder, his injuries should have been severe. Defensive wounds, deep cuts, broken bones. Instead, he had shallow lacerations in places that avoided major arteries or muscles. To medical experts, they looked calculated, not accidental. Wounds meant to be seen, not feared. Then, there was the delay. Prosecutors would later argue that those missing hours were the most damning detail of all. Henri didn't call for help immediately. He didn't run to neighbors. He didn't trigger the estate alarm. Instead, he called his girlfriend. He searched the internet. He waited. During that time, investigators believe his family bled to death. Marley survived not because help came quickly, but because she was young and strong enough to cling to life on her own. When Marley eventually regained consciousness, the family hoped she might hold answers. Instead, doctors delivered another devastating blow. The injury to her brain had caused retrograde amnesia. She had no memory of the attack, no memory of the sound of footsteps in the hallway, no memory of seeing who stood over her with the axe. Whatever truth she might have carried was gone. Police quietly began focusing their attention on Henri. They examined his movements, his phone records, his statements. Each retelling of the story contained small inconsistencies. Details shifted, timelines blurred. His demeanor, described by officers as strangely detached, raised further concern. In recorded interviews, he appeared calm, almost rehearsed, even when describing the violent deaths of his parents and brother. As the case gained media attention, journalists uncovered what investigators already suspected. Henri had been struggling with a serious methamphetamine addiction. His parents had spent large sums sending him to rehabilitation, hoping to save him. When it failed, they cut him off financially. For someone dependent on drugs and accustomed to privilege, the sudden loss of money and control may have felt unbearable. Then there was the estate itself. The Van Breda family assets were substantial. If Martin, Teresa, and Rudy were gone, and Marley was incapacitated, Henri stood to inherit everything. Prosecutors would later emphasize that motive didn't need to be simple or singular. It could be resentment, addiction, entitlement, or a volatile mix of all three. Despite mounting suspicion, Henri wasn't arrested right away. Authorities moved carefully, knowing the case would be scrutinized intensely. Months passed as forensic reports were finalized and expert opinions gathered. Behind the scenes, investigators reconstructed the attack second by second, mapping blood patterns, wound angles, and movement through the house. When Henri was finally arrested in June 2016, the charges were staggering. 3 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and obstruction of justice. He was released on bail, a decision that shocked the public and fueled outrage. How could someone accused of annihilating his own family walk free? When the trial began in 2017, the courtroom became a battleground between 2 versions of the same night. One painted Henri as a traumatized survivor of a home invasion. The other portrayed him as the sole attacker, moving through the house while his family slept, ending 3 lives and nearly a 4th. And at the center of it all was a single haunting question the jury would have to answer. If not him, then who? As the trial unfolded, the prosecution focused on dismantling Henri's story piece by piece, not with emotion, but with cold precision. They didn't need a confession, they didn't need a dramatic eyewitness. What they had was a sequence of facts that, when placed together, left little room for doubt. One of the most damaging elements was the security evidence. Experts testified that no alarms had been triggered that night, no perimeter breaches were recorded, no guard reported suspicious movement. The idea that one or more intruders could have entered, committed the attack, and escaped without activating a single layer of security was described as virtually impossible. This wasn't just unlikely, it defied the design of the estate itself. Then came the blood evidence. Specialists explained how blood spatter patterns showed the attacker stood close to each victim, delivering repeated, controlled blows. There was no indication of a chaotic struggle involving multiple attackers. The force used was consistent from room to room, suggesting the same person carried out every strike. The prosecution emphasized that violence of this nature requires stamina, focus, and intent. This was not a panicked reaction. It was sustained action. Henri's injuries were placed under a microscope in court. Medical experts testified that they did not match defensive wounds. They were shallow, linear, and placed in areas unlikely to be struck during a real fight. One expert described them as hesitation wounds, the kind often seen when someone inflicts harm on themselves rather than being attacked. The implication was clear. These injuries were part of the story, not the struggle. The timeline continued to haunt the defense. Phone records showed Henri had ample opportunity to call for help, but didn't. Prosecutors argued that during those missing hours, he believed everyone was dead. He did not know Marley was still alive. Only when daylight approached did he call emergency services, at a point when the outcome was already sealed. The calm tone of his voice on the call, they argued, was not the voice of someone waking up to horror, but of someone executing the final step of a plan. Henri took the stand in his own defense. He spoke about fear, confusion, and trauma. He described seeing his father attacked, trying to intervene, then blacking out. He insisted he loved his family and had no reason to hurt them, but under cross-examination, cracks appeared. When asked to physically demonstrate how the attacker had swung the axe, his movements mirrored the angles found on the victim's wounds. When questioned about smoking a cigarette outside while his family lay bleeding inside, the courtroom fell silent. The prosecution didn't need to editorialize. The image spoke for itself. The defense attempted to shift focus toward Henri's drug addiction, arguing it had impaired his judgment and memory. They suggested he was an unreliable narrator of his own experience, not a calculating killer. They pointed to the lack of a clear confession, the absence of eyewitness testimony, and the emotional weight of accusing a son of destroying his entire family. But the judge was unmoved by emotional appeals. In his ruling, he emphasized that the evidence formed a single, unavoidable conclusion. There was no sign of intruders, no alternative suspect, no plausible explanation that fit the physical facts of the scene. Every path led back to Henri. On May 21, 2018, the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts, 3 murders, 1 attempted murder, obstruction of justice. The courtroom absorbed the words in stunned silence. Henri showed little visible reaction. Marley, protected from public view, was not present. She would never hear the verdict with a memory of why it mattered. Sentencing followed swiftly. 3 life sentences for the murders of his parents and brother. An additional sentence for the attempted murder of his sister. Appeals were filed, then dismissed. Again and again, higher courts upheld the conviction, citing the overwhelming consistency of the evidence. Yet even after the verdict, the case refused to settle into certainty. Supporters continued to argue Henri's innocence. Friends, a girlfriend, even a former counselor expressed disbelief that he could commit such brutality. They pointed to the absence of a confession, to his calm demeanor, to the complexity of trauma responses. But the law is not built on what feels possible. It is built on what can be proven. And what remained was this: a fortified home with no intruders, a family destroyed from within, and a survivor who remembers nothing, except that her life was split cleanly into before and after, by a night she will never recall. Yet even after the verdict, the case refused to settle into certainty. Supporters continued to argue Henri's innocence. Friends, a girlfriend, even a former counselor expressed disbelief that he could commit such brutality. They pointed to the absence of a confession, to his calm demeanor, to the complexity of trauma responses. But the law is not built on what feels possible. It is built on what can be proven. And what remained was this: a fortified home with no intruders, a family destroyed from within, and a survivor who remembers nothing, except that her life was split cleanly into before and after, by a night she will never recall. Next, in 500 words, along with CTA. Even now, years after the verdict, the case continues to divide public opinion in a way few crimes ever do. On one side are the court records, the forensic findings, the security analysis, and the judge's unequivocal ruling. On the other are the lingering human questions that no verdict can fully silence. How does a family collapse so completely in a single night? How does someone grow up inside privilege, protection, and opportunity, yet still reach a point where violence becomes the answer? For Marley, the only surviving victim, the truth exists without memory. She lives with the consequences of that night, but without access to the moments that caused them. No images, no sounds, no faces. Her life was spared, but her past was erased. She will never remember her parents' final words, her brother's attempt to protect her, or the person who stood over her as she nearly died. Healing for her is not about remembering, it's about rebuilding an identity from fragments, surrounded by questions she can never personally answer. For the wider public, the case became a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable realities. It forced people to confront the idea that danger doesn't always come from outside the gates. That violence can grow quietly inside homes that look perfect from the street. That addiction, resentment, entitlement, and silence can combine into something catastrophic when left unaddressed. Henri van Breda remains in prison, still maintaining his innocence. The appeals have failed, the courts have spoken, but belief is not governed by court orders, and doubt does not disappear on sentencing day. Some still believe there is more to the story. Others believe the story is exactly what it appears to be, a calculated act followed by a carefully constructed lie that unraveled under scrutiny. What cannot be disputed is the outcome. 3 lives ended, 1 life permanently altered, an entire family erased from its future. No sentence, no appeal, no debate can undo that. Cases like this linger because they challenge our assumptions. They remind us that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like sons, siblings, students, or neighbors. Sometimes the warning signs are subtle, sometimes they're ignored, and sometimes, by the time the truth surfaces, it's already too late. As you reflect on this story, ask yourself the hard questions. Were there warning signs that could have been taken more seriously? Could intervention have changed the outcome? Or was this tragedy already set in motion long before that final night? If stories like this make you think deeper about human behavior, justice, and the thin line between appearance and reality, make sure to support the channel by liking the video, share it with someone who values thoughtful discussion, not just headlines, and subscribe so you don't miss future deep dives into cases that challenge what we think we know about crime, family, and the hidden truths behind closed doors.